That includes me, of course.
Mhm.
I try a little bit, but I notice there's a lot of people that don't think there's any requirement to try to think.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, but the problem is, I think they think they're thinking. And
Well,
when you run into that, yeah, what do you do? What do you do? I don't know.
a pre-established method, which I feel thoroughly comfortable with, yes, that's the results of thinking.
Well, and I saw a Aldous Huxley quote, a meme based on an Aldous Huxley quote, and unlike a lot of memes, this one has he actually said it, where he refers to not thinking through problems as a sin against the mind, against the human mind.
Mhm.
And I thought, well, that's interesting. I'd never thought about the concept of sins against the human mind. I know the New Testament authors translated, they wrote the Greek for sin was hamartia, which in Greek means missing the mark. It's an archer's term, which is an interesting conception of sin. And I thought about that. And then I thought, well, maybe there's two different kinds of sins related to the human mind. Maybe there's sins against the human mind, but there's also sins committed by the human mind that are just built right into it. And if we talk about rationality and people not thinking, of course, part of where my brain wants to go is, well, that accounts for some of the problems, and the other problems are mostly caused by people thinking and being rational. Because rationality and thinking have certain strengths and certain weaknesses, and they carry them both along with them whenever you do them. And so part of what we're always trying to figure out when we look at the mess we're in is, how much of this did we do by not thinking about it, and how much of it did we do by thinking about it? It's, Kenneth Smith has a line. He says, if the nature of the problem that you're suffering was the result of your thinking about it the wrong way, more thinking is only going to compound the problem, not solve it.
Yeah.
You need a new way to think. And this goes back to his definition of philosophy, when he says every other subject gives you something new to think about. Only philosophy gives you something new to think with.
Mm.
Well, I can say with the present world situation, it's very good they've gone on a crusade against the evil Russians. Unfortunately, it might result in all of us being buried under radioactive buildings at some point. But hey, we've got to do the right thing.
It's a small price to pay, isn't it? Extermination in order to, to prove that our side is right. And the other side is wrong.
Yeah, well, that was Daffy Duck, wasn't it? In Duck Rogers of the 24th and a half century with Marvin the Martian.
I love Marvin the Martian so much.
I wonder if thinking is thinking about your experiences in the world, but thinking about thinking is thinking about your experiences of thinking. I wonder whether thinking about thinking is not a technical way of analyzing what you're thinking about. So that might get you into a further loop, but it might also resolve the problem of thinking itself. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, you could have a myriad of thinking thoughts, but they might not sum up to anything in particular. I mean, they're just kind of like all general, scatter everywhere, and in some way. Whereas thinking about thinking, if you are thinking about the thinking part itself, that seems like a process oriented about the mechanics of thinking in some sense, right? And that's a different type of thinking.
That's right. Yeah. I mean,
well,
ultimately,
that's the question of thought.
Good.
Yeah, well, you can think about objects. I see a horse over there in the paddock. I'm thinking about that. They call that concrete thought. But we can have thoughts which don't relate to any particular object. They call that abstract thinking. Now, they believe thought probably started off thinking about real objects, but then you've got this piece of machinery called thought, which is essentially always an abstraction. If I see a horse in a paddock, and I picture that horse in my head, I've abstracted an idea into my head which seems to correspond to reality. But you can start thinking about things which don't actually exist, like unicorns. That's a popular one. You can take a horn which belongs on one animal, stick it on the horse and say, hey, that's a unicorn. We all love unicorns. We all love a mythical creature which apparently doesn't exist. Although maybe they do exist on some planet far, far away in the universe. Thank you.
Well, but I think that kind of thinking, in a way, and I'm not saying that I'm not involved with that myself, is that once you begin to think about thinking, what happened is that the abstraction in thinking, in the process of thinking, instead of being mere abstraction, it becomes real. I mean, it really is, it objectifies itself. And so once it objectifies itself, you treat it as an object of thought. And I'm thinking, like, I've been thinking very much about the economy, because the economy is in bad shape, the global economy. And I just heard it recently, somebody talked about the economy, and he says, well, the problem with capitalism is that capitalism is no longer capitalism. Let me preface this, because we know in the Enlightenment, the two legs was the liberation of the human spirit and the liberation of capital. We know that the liberation of capital has somehow impinged itself upon the liberation of human spirit and stultified it. But now the liberation of thinking in terms of capital has taken down capital itself. He says what we are now in is no longer a capitalist world, but a creditalism world. In other words, the derivative of capital has become credit. And we are trapped in the credit cycle that suspends itself and refeeds into what we think is capital. And that's the problem, is the diversion of that. And it's very difficult for us to get out of the creditalism, which is sort of like, and we're struggling to get out. And every time we try to get out, we get scared, and then we pump more money into the system, create more credit. And what that does is that it diverges the difference between the rich and the poor even further than capital itself, because the rich have money to borrow credit and get more money by using the money as collateral to buy things. And so therefore, whereas like the poor people, they get credit, but they have to pay a lot of interest, 17% interest. So they're getting
I might
poor.
argue I disagree, because Bill Gates is buying farmland, a capital asset, which might prove very valuable.
Yeah, right. Well, that's because he
Right.
has enough money to buy the farmland through the credit market. So, I think that's what we're trapped in, and I don't know how we're going to get out of it.
And then we keep printing money as
That's right.
though it's representative of some worth. And this insanity of continuing to print money in the last few decades is scary too. I mean, it is no longer money. It's a kind of pretension, isn't it really?
Yeah, I just like that term, creditalism.
Yeah.
I do too, Phil. There was a thing out of talking about the confusion of great debt with great wealth.
Yeah.
And
Right.
So the point
well-
is down. So down goes the Enlightenment. Both legs are knocked out.
You get laid into an epoch like modernity, and it is mutating dramatically. It's mutating. The accumulation of small changes over the centuries grows to the point it turns into qualitative change, and it's becoming something else. But its models for itself are all based on the earlier form. And so you get this mismatch that grows between what we think we are and what we actually are, that makes it harder and harder for us to control ourselves, because we pull levers that don't connect to anything anymore, if you know what I mean. It's like back, I was reading about the early history of money. It's really interesting. There's a lot of archaeology on this that suggests that a lot of it came out of temples originally, rather than the marketplace. They were tokens that you could acquire to donate to the, to give to the god or goddess, to show your, that you cared. And you acquired these tokens, by bringing food and water and wine and other things that the temple needed to run itself. So you were trading goods and services for, for these kind of rare, precious tokens. And then I guess it was in Asia Minor that they then took that idea and broadened it, started using it for other things, and discovered, oh my goodness, the exchange of goods and services for tokens can be really powerful. So that's like, when we think about money, we think of it in those terms, that we're exchanging this token for goods and services. But as you point out with creditalism, you start getting these levels where the abstraction begins to feed upon itself. And pretty soon it's not clear what the token stands for.
Right.
And, it's one thing if the purpose of the token is that you want to acquire it so you can give it to the gods. It's like Charon and the last obol that goes over the eyes of the dead so they can cross the river Styx. That's one thing, right? This is money you don't want to have. You want to. It's just a token of your fidelity. But the real value is in the things that you bring to the temple, that the temple needs in order to survive. But we've now inverted that relationship, where you can't have the things that you need to survive unless you've got the tokens, because we're all disconnected from the means of production. Most of us don't have enough farmland to feed ourselves. We don't have enough sheep. If we did, we don't have a loom or the skills to clothe ourselves. We're utterly dependent upon the abstraction now, rather than the abstraction being a temporary moment, in a relationship with the divine.
I'm going to pull up is and ought at this
Please,
moment.
yeah, go ahead.
Is and ought,
Go to.
that I get to the point where people are saying, well, it shouldn't be like this. Good old Albert Ellis is saying, if people start saying, I have the instincts of being a hunter-gatherer, all the goodies of the world belong to me. Yeah, that's fine when there's only a few people around, but now there's 8 billion. And I'm not prejudiced about any outcome. I'm simply saying having 8 billion people on the planet is different from having a few million.
Yeah.
Things are going to be different.
This goes with Nietzsche, right? When he says, power makes stupid, part of what he's talking about is the process of which it affects your intelligence. But part of it is the same reflexes that serve you very well when you don't have very much power, like swatting at a fly, become a problem when instead of a hand you have nuclear weapons. You're like, I'll just swat that. Oops, I've accidentally destroyed vast swaths of productive land and killed a lot of people. Well, that wasn't my intention. I just wanted to make the annoyance go away, but I don't have anything anymore. at the level of power, the low level of power required to deal appropriately. I've muscled up too much. You know, I was watching the Marvel TV series She-Hulk, and in the first episode, when she gains her mighty strength, you know, she's hanging out with her cousin Bruce Banner, the Hulk, and he's having to explain to her how everything gets harder. It's like you can't pick up a cup because the normal amount of pressure you apply would shatter it. And you're having to learn to be very delicate and you know, cautious about everything, because your power is this enormous problem that you can barely control. And I think that's very Nietzschean, right? I mean, this is all of the Hulk stuff is just a metaphor for Nietzsche's talk about power and stupidity and the difficulties of controlling it. So same with anything that grows. The population grows too big, our technological level grows too high. Money ceases to be a little tool that we use for things and instead becomes the organizing principle for everything that we do. Anything that grows to that level requires us to massively reconsider how we're going to deal with it, because the strategies that worked for us when we were weaker aren't going to work for us when we're stronger. I keep thinking about my teenage years and how I kept running into door jams because I was growing. My body wasn't where I thought it was. And I tried to do the thing that always had worked before. And next thing I know, a few weeks later, I'm covered in bruises, you know, and the people at school are like, you know, are you being beaten at home? Only by myself. Anyway, so let's turn to the text, because I think we can wrap up section C and move on to D today. This is built. My apologies for not being here the last 2 weeks. Speaking of the stupidities about the economy, I'm trying to save my nonprofit. So I've been working for the last month and a half, working on bids to get us a gig that'll get us funding so that we can pay the bills, because, you know, the landlord likes it when we pay our rent. So let's go to the text. So we've been taught, this is the section C, form and matter, organicism and arete. And he's talking in this about the fit of form to matter, and how if you try to just stamp out your will upon the world uniformly everywhere, you screw it up. You have to be sensitive to the actual conditions of the thing that you're trying to mold. And it means that, you know, Italian culture has to be different from Japanese culture, which has to be different from American culture or Australian culture, what have you. You have to pay attention to the differences, or else everything goes awry. And so as a result, he's using this section to try to break through our preconceptions about intelligence or character as being a universal thing that's the same everywhere, and trying to get us to think about the specific details of character matter. Now, exactly what are you good at or bad at? You know, what do you tend to notice or tend to overlook? These things have a tremendous effect upon the shape of your life and how you could organize yourself. And so in this section, he's working his way up to the issue of government, and how did the Greeks, how did the ancients generally imagine people could successfully organize themselves? And in these last two paragraphs, he's pulling all the points from A, B, and C together into this conclusion. And the conclusion makes it crystal clear that the ancients didn't think about human nature, human intelligence, or human government the way that moderns do. So here we go. The Greeks were aristocratic. That is, they thought that aristoi should rule, not that whoever ruled were aristoi, but that people who were aristoi should be the ones to do the ruling. And this is what we talked about in previous months. The Greeks were aristocratic precisely because they were pessimistic about the intrinsic love for truth, among most humans, and their profound or characterological educability. That is, the ancient Greeks thought that most people did not intrinsically love the truth. They intrinsically loved falsehood, because falsehoods are created by people to deceive other people. And as part of that deception, falsehoods are carefully tailored and crafted to be as appealing as possible. Mm-hmm. But Mother Nature did no such work on the truth. She doesn't care if we believe the truth or not. If we can align ourselves to the truth, then we can survive and thrive. And if we don't, well, then she'll mow us under and try some other species. It's our duty, not nature's duty, to learn to find the truth lovable even when it's bitter. But people get that sweet tooth for all the deceptions that have been specially crafted to serve their interests, to tug on their desires. And so that sweet tooth makes them unable to appreciate the bitter but clear qualities of the truth. It's possible to develop a love for the truth. And if you luck out, if you've got the right kind of character, or if you work at it decade after decade after decade, if you've got a culture that helps you learn the discipline of developing your character, you can acquire a taste for the truth that you didn't have in your youth. But it's hard work. So you have to have a taste for hard work, which, again, becomes another step in the problem of what does it take to get people to the point where they would prefer a clear, bitter truth over a mouth-watering deception. And the ancients were pessimistic about this. They said they didn't know to what extent human character could change over time. They knew that it could. It's part of their core concept of free will and determinism, which we've talked about in previous months. We'll probably talk about again. This ethos anthropoi daimon, right, from Heraclitus. Ethos, man's character is fate. Character is fate. But in such a way that if you garden your character, if you cultivate your character, you can change your fate. This is the core ancient idea about the relationship between, human beings and their character and what they're free or not free to do. So the Greeks saw that it could be changed, but it was very hard to develop in people the love of doing that work to change it. And later on, Diogenes would build on these ideas with his lantern in the marketplace, during daylight, searching for an honest man. He's saying, what kind of character do we all have, and should we be ashamed at how much we love deceiving ourselves and flattering ourselves and seducing ourselves? So this issue of pessimism, partly this is going to have to do with their observations over time about human beings and what they're like. Partly it's going to be their circumstances, going back to Kenneth Smith's point in section C about the fit of form to matter. Who were the Greeks? Well, the Greeks were the distant descendants of people who had a great heroic civilization and blew it up in the Trojan War. Their whole tone for understanding themselves and their history was one of tragedy, and not the modern sense of tragedy of a hurricane came in and isn't that tragic. No, a tragedy in which we made the hurricane and did it to ourselves. It didn't have to happen. It wouldn't have happened if it weren't for us. We hoisted ourselves on our own petard. And it wasn't the worst of us who did that. It was the best of us who did that. The great heroes of our past, who we idolize, who we trace our tribal genealogies back to, Heracles and Theseus and Odysseus and Achilles, all these people who we admire were the ones who blew everything up. And the key of tragedy that they composed their plays in was saying they didn't blow it up by accident. They blew it up on purpose because of their virtues. It wasn't the weak spots in them that were responsible for the disaster. It was the strong spots in them that were responsible for the disaster. And, thus the Greeks, after that disaster, cultivate the art of tragedy to try to get people used to thinking about this paradox, that the things that you're best at are a two-edged sword. They are both a means to solve problems, but also through the law of unintended consequences, they create more problems, and that we have to understand both sides of our nature if we're going to move responsibly through the world. And they tried and tried and tried. These descendants of the heroic age tried and tried through religion, through art, through music, through everything that they could think of. They tried to cultivate a culture in which everybody got taught, everybody got trained. You tried to make sure that everyone got these core lessons about human nature that were required to maybe do better in the future than as a civilization they had in the past. And still, as he'll say later in this section, they could only get about a third of their population to be what they considered to be heuristic, to have these insights. And that made them pessimistic. Now, whether the pessimism is warranted or not, it's a whole other topic. But it's important if we want to understand the ancient worldview to know that that pessimism is baked right into it. It's core to it. And it helps inform the kinds of politics that they thought were appropriate for organizing human society, which we'll talk about in a moment. But first, Phil and then Geneva. Go ahead, Phil. Oops, I just put you on mute. Come back off.
Yeah, I'm going to push back a little bit on that. I agree. I agree with actually everything you said. But the problem in some ways is share between human capacities and the world itself. I don't mean the world to be blamed. It's just that the truth is so difficult and ambiguous that first of all, most people are not able to handle it. And second of all, even the people who are able to handle it can never really quite get to it. And this is what I mean. I'll go back to Plato. Well, I'll start with last week. I went to a talk and my niece was in it. She's a environmental scientist and she studies phytoplanktons. And she's saying something that was very interesting. She says, when you get to the size of phytoplanktons, everything we intuitively know about how things work changes because the context is so different. Because of their size and the substance around them, they can't just sort of do what we would do and move through the water or whatever. It's like, she says, it's kind of like trying to swim in molasses. That is the context. And I asked her a question and she at first didn't think she knew how to answer it. I said, I assured her that she would be able to. And I said, oh yeah, this is what Heidegger said as a critique of Kant in his metaphysics. He says the problem with Kant is that it reduces things to a system and a structure of understanding. But the problem with that is in some ways is not connected to being itself, ontology. And in order to understand the thing that's manifested, you have to understand the contextual nature of the thing and its context and relation. And not only does each individual thing have its own little context, but the whole of the context changes because the dynamics within that system changes. And so understanding being is almost an impossible task. And you have to understand the ontology before you even spin out the metaphysics. And so I'm thinking, and that brings me back to Plato in a way, because Plato is trying to deal with Parmenides being is, what is the is, right? And you can't just sort of leave it there and so he's thinking, well, I think with Plato, the relationship is actually between beings in the world, things, objects, and the forms, which is a conceptual idea that we have in relationship to understanding the world. I think he never got there because it is almost impossible to bridge the gap between the ontological difference between being and beings. And I think there's always an aspiration for Plato that we had that aspiration, and therefore it almost seems to say, yeah, you're stuck in that divide, and you must be, in a sense, fluid enough to always negotiate, but not only fluid enough to negotiate, you have to also admit that you'll never get there. That always remains somewhat ambiguous. Okay, so that's the dimension that he set up. And that's hard to ask anybody to do, right? Because they want, give me the answer. And you say, oh, the answer is very, very complex. We don't quite get it because it's always changing a dynamic.
Yes.
Because next thing you know, E equals MC squared completely changes the context of something else.
Yes.
And Aristotle, of course, follow up by saying, no, this dialectic that creates a tension is not embodied in that relationship, but a technique of thinking in which you could evolve in terms of somehow resolving the ontological difference.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure whether you could ever get there because it's always changing. The context, not just the objects themselves, but the context. And so therefore, in a sense, you are asking people in the sense that do what it can't be done. And most people like, oh, just give me the good stuff. You know, we don't need all this, whatever. And living in the city gates, as I've been saying all along, is a difficult task because you're constantly equivocating. And one of the things I always thought about Plato that was interesting, he was always stressing about this sort of the forms, you know, and he exalted mathematics, but he always wrote his dialogues in poetic form, and he was against the poets. So that's almost an admission that the language itself cannot bear down on getting you there. Perhaps it could get close. Perhaps living it with that in that tension is exactly the place that we are trapped into. And to ask somebody like, I can't give you an answer. You're just gonna have to figure it out. It's like, say what? Say what, coach? Say what, karate master? Like, what are you? This is ridiculous. Okay, so yes, you are in that, and to get somebody not only to have the intellect to understand that ambiguity of the ontological difference, and to have the psychological fortitude to do that, I just think that's a tough ask. And you have to have somebody who, in a sense, almost have to coax them into maybe some lower level that will harmonize with it. That's all you can really do. So that's my pushback. Yes, I agree with you, but it's hard to tell somebody, suffer, 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 suffer. That's it.
Thank you, Phil. I'll come back to that point anon, but I'm gonna walk through the other folks first. It's a critically important point. You know, it's easy to get people comfortable with the idea that they're walking on solid ground. It's not at all easy to get them comfortable with the idea that what is solid is actually mostly empty. And it's almost the actual matter involved there is minuscule. You're basically hovering, not actually, you know, solid. This blows people's minds, right? So it's the same with, you know, what is true and what is not true, what is being and what is not. All of these fundamental questions that you think of as, well, if I can't answer that, how can I do anything? You know, they all end up resolving into a matrix of paradoxes under our feet, you know, mentally. You know, how do you make people comfortable with this reality that they find themselves in? We'll come back to this. I think we'll come back to this through the entire rest of this book and the rest of all of Kenneth Smith's works. You put your finger on the recurring theme of the problem. Geneva, go ahead.
Yeah, well, welcome back. I was just listening to what you said about the heroes and the Trojan War and how they brought down the whole society. And I think you also said something about this was something that should be done, I guess, by nature versus man taking it into his own hands and causing the destruction of the civilization. And I wonder if they hadn't done that, men hadn't done that, nature wouldn't have stepped in and done it for them, because it was just time for that to happen. It was time for that civilization to go down so that we could create something else, something better, worse, whatever, but something different. And it made me think of like Pompeii, where, you know, everything was like covered. It's like, okay, now they've got to start all over again and rebuild things. So I wonder if man had not taken those steps to destroy the civilization as he knew it, would nature have probably stepped in and done it for him because it was just time? I don't know.
Yeah, so the challenge here is the delta between what nature wants for us and what we want for ourselves. So, you know, nature's perfectly happy with having us, you know, wiped off the planet. You know, for most of human existence, for most of the history of the planet, there was no Homo sapiens, and it got along just fine without us. So the problem for us is, if we want to stick around, we can't trust nature to solve that problem for us. Nature's interests are not aligned with our interests in this case. So we have to exert ourselves to come up with a solution better than the default solution, if that's what nature has planned for us. And of course, these are all metaphors, right? It's very tough to talk about the teleology of nature. So, of course, once we get into trying to make the things we want happen, we get into a huge tangled area that Heraclitus wrote about, which is, yeah, but which of our wants are healthy for us and which ones are unhealthy for us? And there's a lot to be navigated there. And when, you know, we talk a lot about Heraclitus saying it would not be better for men if they got what they wanted. But he's not trying to say that we should get nothing we want. Because some of our wants are things like, you know, we're thirsty, we want a drink of water. Why shouldn't we have a drink of water? It's not hurting anybody. We just need a drink, right? It's not the case that everything we want is ipso facto bad or wrong. It's rather that as mortals who have a finite perspective on the world, our understanding of our wants and the consequences that flow from them are also finite, and thus prone to mistakes. And what we would like to do is get a little wiser in our choices so that we can choose things, the consequences of which are less dire. You know, that we want a better bang for buck ratio on the good things that flow versus the unfortunate things that flow from our choices. But this is very hard to cultivate. And of course, part of that, it has to do with learning enough about nature to figure out what nature would do if we didn't intervene, so that when we shape our plans for what we're going to try to do, we try to make sure that they harmonize with nature, and we're not going to collide directly with things that aren't going to let us do this, or that would have terrible consequences. It's a whole complicated area, and it's really, as you know, going back now, it's going to happen every single time anybody speaks. I'm going to keep tying it back to Phil because of what Phil said. This goes back to that problem of, how do you explain to people the problem of desire and choice? That on the one hand, you have to have desire. I mean, you have it whether you want it or not, because we're wired that way, but you have to have desire. You have to be able to make choices. But on the other hand, a lot of our choices get us in trouble. You know, you're stuck in this equivocation between the intended consequences and the unintended consequences, and having to navigate them, no matter what. Everything's more complicated than we think it is. You know, I'm like, some days I think we should just ban the word just. When someone says, I don't want any of that, I'm just trying to do X. It's like, oh, you little mortal, you think that is separable from the rest of the cosmos. You don't know what you're tugging on when you just do X. You might be setting in motion things that will go on for thousands of years. Just as to properly assess whether we are just doing something, we would have to know everything. And this goes back to the core Achilles heel of science, which is ceteris paribus, all else being equal. Well, how do you know if all else is equal? You'd have to know all else. You'd have to, you know, have divine omniscience. That can't be a prerequisite for the conduct of science, because we're never going to be there. Stephen, and then Donald, and then Joseph. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I'll just make the point. I don't regard myself as the most intelligent man in the universe. So I'm at the back of the line saying, you know, that guy in Monty Python who's saying, well, anyway, I've pursued knowing a bit about the balance sheets of central banks. And this is a weird thing. I come across in person and online all these people that think they know everything, but not one of them can read the central bank balance sheet and understand it. Okay, this is something I've looked into, I've come to a little bit of understanding about, but there's nobody else I've come across, really. Now, as regards the out of control or apparently out of control inflation at the moment, okay, we're in a circle with President Biden. He says this inflation problem is terrible. Is there a fix for it? And I could, being one of the advisors, I could open up an ancient science fiction book and I said, apparently 50 or 100 years ago, just about everyone knew there was a simple answer. And President Biden says, great, we've got an answer. Please give me the answer. And well, apparently you cut government spending. At that point, I'll disappear through the trapdoor to the alligator pit down below. That's one major answer to controlling inflation. Now, all you guys out there who are all worried about the inflation, how many would agree with the method of cutting government spending? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Donald and then Joseph. Go ahead, Donald.
Oh, I just like what Phil says. And, you know, there's a problem that he alludes to that we still have. You know, Heraclitus, the philosopher of change and flux, the basis of a lot of what we're studying and of many, the thing, I mean, all is change, but even Heraclitus in his pithy little aphorisms detects a pattern, a sameness within the otherness. Now, Plato observed that, hey, mathematics is kind of doing the same thing. Not that that's the source of truth or rationality, but it's kind of what we wish for philosophy or for human wisdom, that we identify, I don't know, moral triangles, moral circles, or something that fit our existence. And I'll use the word here. I'll say, I wish we had an ideology, not a real ideology the way we use it, but some science of ideas that let us know which of these patterns or some way to determine are real. Now, Aristotle took this up too, and then this is what when Hegel, you know, the branch, the flower, the branch, the bud, the flower. Any of these things that show that we experience ourselves, a continuity through time and change. What does that mean? How do we make sense of that? And so, yeah, Plato was one of the first. I mean, yes, he's a reaction to Parmenides. Well, nothing changes. Well, that doesn't quite work either. Or all is change. But no, there's some continuity within the change that if we recognize, these are these arche, the patterns of the flux. It's not chaos. We're not stuck in chaos. We're stuck in change. We're stuck in becoming. And you know, Aristotle took this up. all this. I think Phil is right on a critical problem. And I appreciate his observations about Plato. Plato's not offering a solution. He's pointing, these are things we really experience existentially, and nobody thinks that Plato is an existentialist except me, maybe sometimes. You know, he's pointing, exactly right. He's pointing a lot to real phenomena in his poetic stories, so maybe we can see the infinite in the finite. Maybe we can see the pattern, the sameness that's in the otherness, the constancy in the change. Thank you, Phil.
And thank you, Donald. If there's he's writing here at this point in section C, Kenneth is writing about this pessimism, but they weren't, he's doing that to make a point. It's not Kenneth's total take on the issue, because if they were complete pessimists, they wouldn't have bothered engaging in anthropoculture. Their whole focus on paideia and how are the children raised and how do you cultivate arts to try to make deep truths accessible and memorable to even the dullest of us. You know, this was a major focus in Greek culture precisely because their pessimism wasn't, it was a meliorism, I think, rather than strictly a pessimism. It wasn't just, we're all doomed, let's give up. It was, this is a much harder problem than anybody thinks it is. We don't even know if we can succeed, but we do know that if we work at it, we could do better tomorrow than we did today. So let's see how we can solve these problems and move the ball down the field and find out what happens and learn together, you know, whether or not this is doable. It's an interesting kind of pessimism. We almost don't have a word for it in English, but meliorism kind of captures at least a part of it. If pessimism and meliorism had a child, that would be the ancient perspective on the prospect of cultivating human beings whose character would make them love the truth. Joseph, go ahead.
So I'll just be really brief. I would be behind the line and behind Stephen in line. So, you know, as far as and this problem, it's interesting, this idea of that the Greeks were pessimistic about this love for the truth. Because I've been doing some deep soul searching recently. And I start to think about the root of my desires. And we're talking about that, you know, essentially. And I don't know the truth. and I think to myself, even if I knew it, would I love it? And even if I got to know what my desires, what the root cause of my desires were, would I love the truth, right? And so I think that there's a reason for skepticism. Let's just say what Stephen said was true, you know, about government spending. You know, we can debate, you know, some of the what he said, but just take for, would we love it if it were true? I mean, you know, would we embrace it? You know, that's part of the point, is that Biden all of a sudden was saying, oh, maybe I don't like this. That's why I just find it to be, the pessimism to be, you know, somewhat, I find it to be accurate I mean, or warranted, because, you know, personally, I think that but that being said, if you do love the truth, then you understand the discipline that has to go into place in order to manage both yourself or whatever else we're talking about. So anyway, I know it's a little bit abstract, but it's this, if you can be misled if you if you follow your desires, right? So getting to the truth, it's both hard and it's both difficult to manage. I know that's a little all over the place, but I hope you can follow.
Good. No, it's good stuff. And it's personal, right? I mean, you said
Right.
abstract, but the truth is it's very concrete. You're describing your own concrete experience.
Yeah, that's what I'm going through. I mean, it's like, why do I desire these things? And, what is the real, and it's something that I personally have had to deal with, pretty much my entire life, is that, I'm going down roads, not by, but by following maybe other people's desires as well, in addition to that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It is. Yeah, I don't, and the thing that you're going to embrace the truth on top of that, that's kind of, I'm a little bit skeptical. that
Asking a
people
lot,
would-
as Phil said.
I think it's asking a lot for the general public, but I do like the idea that making it accessible to communities, and somehow making this knowledge accessible. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph. So, what do I want to say about this? Hegel talks, I keep stressing this point. Hegel gets criticized for focusing the role of the negation of the negative in his description of the dialectic and how change happens. But the critics who don't like his use of the negative, I think, are missing the point. And it's directly relevant to what you're saying, Joseph, because now, how do you come to love the bitter, clear truth? There's only one way, and it's out of frustration and shame and rage at the consequences of following the sweet tooth in one's own life. It's only when you have gone through the catastrophic experiences that have led you to hold your own need for falsehood in contempt, and not in an abstract distance contempt. I mean, in a visceral, there are major stages of your life that went badly specifically because of it, and you clearly understand and cannot avoid understanding the connection between the two. It's not just that you see, but you lived through, painfully, agonizingly lived through the experience of your own desires leading you into destruction enough times to notice the pattern and then to come to hate it. I hate this part of myself that keeps driving me into walls. And I know that's the cause. I don't know it abstractly. I know it because I lived it. And it was the only way to get out of that trap, was to come to push away that part of myself that longs to do the wrong thing. And it's still there, right? It's crackling with energy. It's clawing and biting, and it desperately wants to be in charge. It wants to drive me into another wall. And I can see it there, spitting and hissing. And I know that's me. And that I'm longing. There's this part of me that thinks that it's longing for what it wants because it doesn't understand that what it wants will lead to self-destruction. When you have enough of those experiences, you can start to develop a love for the truth that's built atop this frustration and contempt with your love for falsehood. They're related very closely to each other. And this is where you get the negation issue going on in Hegel. How do you develop Verstand? You develop it by being shamed over and over by the frustrations of Begriff, right? Too many times, tired of pooping my pants, tired of peeing my pants in school, the kids pointing and laughing, tired of, I'm hungry because I didn't plan ahead and bring a lunch, tired of. Too many negative experiences of doing what comes naturally is what leads us to get frustrated and angry and push away and say, I'm going to break out of the flux of experience and create a safe space in which I can plan for a future to avoid having those experiences again, because I can't stand them, because they're so frustrating. They're so demoralizing. That energy that we think of as something to avoid is the very rich soil that makes it possible to grow the Verstand, right? They're directly related. You can't have Verstand without those frustrating experiences with Begriff. It's just not possible. And this, of course, as we've discussed before, Verstand leads into its own trap. The disconnect from your own life and from your own experiences, the disconnect from the juices of life, doing the wrong thing, but it ideologically made sense. How much am I trapped by my ideas and my attachment to them rather than being trapped by my feelings and experiences? Eventually you come to see it's the same goddamn trap all over again, just in an abstracted intellectual way instead of in an emotionalist experiential way. And that's what sets you up to have the potential to begin to want to negate that too. As Hegel says, the negation of the negation, and to go back and to recapture what you lost when you gave up Begriff without losing what you gained when you moved into Verstand. And that's when we come back to Phil and equivocation, right? Because the only solution is to equivocate between the two and not let either one be in charge. And that's how you begin to develop Vernunft, the heuristic mindset. The love for the truth can only be developed through this long sequence of experiences and pain. And, one goes right to Aeschylus and the Agamemnon. Drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain. This is what he's talking about right here. This is Aeschylus in poetic form saying what Hegel will say thousands of years later in his, oh my God, rigorous German analytical abstract intellectual way. He's trying to say that there isn't a short road that gets you directly to wisdom and to this kind of love for the truth. It comes only the hard way. And it comes only the hard way because it's not, even though it is within our nature to be able to develop it, it is a latent capacity waiting to be unfolded. It can't be unfolded at the beginning. Just like you can't get a fruit directly from a bud. You have to develop the blossom. And then from the blossom, you have to develop the fruit. There's no shortcut. We wish there was, but there isn't. The pain is part of the process. It's like these days, most figs aren't pollinated with a wasp that dies and is digested inside the fig, but that's how it used to be done. And they're still in the wild. That's still how it happens. A wasp has to crawl in there and die and be digested by the fig. The pain, the death is part of the process of creating the new life. It's just how you get there. So I'm gonna jump the line and call on Donna, who hasn't spoken yet today, before Phil, and then I'll call on Phil, and then we'll go back to the text. So go ahead, Donna.
Okay. I apologize for the background construction noise that's coming through. But yeah, I'm kind of responding to what you've been talking about, Phil, and you. We tried this one semester in the high school that I was teaching at. We tried to have an after-school program for the kids to talk about these kind of things, to raise their awareness. And possibly 2 or 3 kids out of 500, 600 would show up for these things. And we tried to analyze why it was we couldn't catch them. And one of the things I think was just the American culture we live in and how they're fed most information. And the other thing was that they just haven't hit enough walls yet, and some of that is just living maturity. What you're talking about, Rick, about you hit enough walls and you start smacking your face enough and you start getting these realizations. But we were trying to figure out how to keep the program working, and we, because it was privately funded, and we couldn't have the justification to keep funding it because we didn't have enough kids showing up. But there was one amazing young man. He was a high school hunk, football star. And for some reason, this young man who was being forced in another direction, by his culture, was fascinated by these things. And he was probably the one person that we felt, of all the people that we might have affected, we might have changed the trajectory of his life. And he really wanted to talk. So who knows? I mean, some of the nerds, some of the other kids just didn't show up. This young man showed up every week. It's not easy. in the educational systems we have to do this. I mean, we really wanted to, but I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to create that hook that will get a hold of the kids. I would like suggestions, but I don't know right now. I'm done. So,
Thanks, Donna. Yeah,
mhm.
it's the critical problem. I mean, that's what the ancient Greeks wrestled with for the entire duration of their civilization. It's how on earth can we avoid repeating this mistake? How do we educate the next generation to not go down the same road? And I've mentioned it before, but the great tragedy of ancient Greece is that they knew that road well. It was documented in their greatest epic. Every single Greek child, whether slave or nobleman, was raised on that work to make sure nobody could miss the lesson. And yet, starting with the Peloponnesian War, they went right down the same goddamn road and tore themselves to pieces. And the whole time they were saying, no, what are we doing? We know not to do this. More than any people who has ever lived, we have been cultivated to never repeat this mistake. And yet step by step, we're doing it.
Yeah.
How is this even possible? You know, when you know that that's the ancient Greek perspective, reading Thucydides' Peloponnesian War is an entirely different experience, because you will see passage after passage after passage where, even though he never comes out and says out loud this thing, because all the Greeks already know it, why would they explain it? It's like stating the obvious. To a modern, once you realize that that's the mindset, you can see him thinking it over and over as he's describing passages. He's echoing, deliberately echoing the great epics to try to make sure everybody gets the point. Here we are doing it again. The one thing of all things we said we would never do. So the challenge of how do you educate people to not repeat these mistakes? How do you cultivate Aristeia in a population? You know, it's in some way based on what you're going to see here in section C as we wrap it up here, is that from the Greek perspective, that was the most important task of civilization. And in many ways, it was the only possible justification for civilization, that the purpose of it is to give us a way to try to solve this terrible problem that otherwise we don't know how to solve. So, you know, and that was a culture in which everybody agreed that that was, you know, the purpose of education. Now, we think the purpose of education is to turn out, you know, production units, nice consumers and producers. So you're fighting an uphill battle against modernity, who doesn't even want you to produce Aristeia. So I understand the problem. I wanted to be a teacher. That was when I was in high school. That was what I wanted to do. I wanted to grow up to be a teacher. But talking to all the other teachers around me, I was like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to be allowed to teach. So my hat's off to those of you who really dove in and wrestle with this problem. It's the critical problem. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to address Donald briefly, and then I'm going to address what Joseph had to say, because that's really important. Both are very important. You know, I'm an artist, and aesthetics is sort of like my thing, because it allows you to equivocate in a way. And, you know, I love Artemis. And I think to understand that, I think is to understand perhaps the middle way, in a sense. I don't mean middle in a settling, in sort of whatever, but in between the extremes. And the reason why I love music is because musics seem to understand that there is a structure, but the structure is not absolute. It sort of admits that you can never get there, but you can harmonize to the degree that you can harmonize with the multiplicity of the world in its own way. And so in some sense, maybe that's what we should strive for, is how to harmonize as best we can, but in the context we don't totally understand in a way, rather than saying, this is absolutely it, we got the absolute equation and so forth, which is gonna, change at some other point anyway. So I say that, thank you. I mean, that really brings in the whole fact of harmony is the, I guess the music of the universe in some sense. The other thing I want to say is, like, I've been concerned about the relationship of the self to otherness. I mean, I wish I was even deeper into it. But I think in order to understand otherness, it almost seems to me you have to do two things. One is you have to get to the point of respecting the otherness enough to let it be what it is. I don't mean that you have to get to a point like, oh, everybody loves everybody, that sort of thing, because that could also be sort of smothering. But let them be what they're going to be to the degree, and I don't mean that in an absolute way, but to the degree that they're within a certain bound that is not going to actually destroy others. And I'm going to bring in a kind of a funny metaphor for that. About 15 years ago, I was watching a movie. It was a movie made in Hong Kong called In the Mood for Love. It was about this guy who fell in love with this woman, and they were deeply in love. But there was a kind of a tension. I think she might have been married or whatever. There was something, a problem that they could never resolve. And plus, there was a problem of like that they eventually live in different places. And I think the solution was that he was going to go somewhere, and then she would eventually resolve her problem and come join him. And he waited and waited quite a long time. And it never really happened. And finally, he realized this is the pain that he would have to absorb. Not dish out, but absorb. And so there was a scene that was just incredible to me. He wandered into the forest one day, and he found a tree with a knothole, slightly medium knothole. And he whispered into the knothole how much he loved her, how eternal his love was. And then he covered the knothole with mud to keep it as a secret between himself and his love for her. And then he simply had to let it go, right? Rather than cause a lot of ruckus. And why didn't you come? What's the thing? Start the whole fight or whatever. It just, at some point, you have to realize that I guess you have to be strong enough within yourself to sustain the suffering, And you can't forget it. But I just like the way that he whispered into his knothole. And nobody will know except him, not even her, about what he had to let go and give up. So I think if you don't have that fortitude to, in a sense, suffer what cannot be, you will end up exporting it elsewhere. And I thought that was a deeply moving movie in that scene, because he truly was in love, and he was willing to say, well, that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
I have to live with it. So I just thought I'd say that. And I think learning how to suffer allows you that degree of latitude in the world.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there's an issue here of you go through a potent experience and it exceeds what you thought was possible. And now that you've experienced it, you no longer believe that's impossible. You know that it's possible. And as a result, your character has dilated and can accommodate more of the world. You're less finite, or to express it in the terms the Greeks did, you're less mortal. You know, they saw mortality and finitude and error as being closely related. It's like, even though you can't dilate the duration of your life, you can dilate the amplitude of your life and be capable of things you didn't think you were capable of before. And learning to go through suffering and survive it, and maybe even grow from it, is something that when you're a little kid, you can't imagine. You think pain is to be avoided and pleasure is to be sought. And it's only by going through these experiences and coming out the other side that you begin to realize, I can survive things I didn't think I could survive. I can actually endure pain that I thought was unendurable. And in so doing, we create a little space for freedom for ourselves. We become less deterministic, less the symptoms of our society and our culture around us, and we create some room within ourselves to make meaningful choices. What you're describing with him doing with the pain of the love is a classic example of that. You know, that he doesn't have to just ricochet back the consequences and create chaos around him. He can dilate himself to create the space necessary to hold that and be its conservator, to limit the impact on others. There's really interesting work done on this area. So, this goes back to Donna's question. How do you educate people about the possibilities? And one of the answers is part of what you're describing. You do it through profound experiences, because you can talk to people all day long, but they're still going to interpret it in light of the experiences they've already had. To have new experiences to reveal to them the things that they never would have believed were possible before they went through it. Heraclitus, a lot of his most potent observations, we now know, came through the Eleusinian mysteries. The mystery religions in Greece differed from the primary religions in that they were, just like we're talking about, they were experience driven. You would be brought in to have an experience different from anything you'd ever had in your life before. And it would be done in a context so that you could interpret it and grow from it and dilate your character. I can't remember who it was who said, the Eleusinian mysteries, which have to do with learning not to be afraid of death, learning to understand death's place in the cycle of life and continuity of life on Earth. One of the Greeks said it was the single most important contribution to Greek culture, to get people to be less afraid of what was going to happen anyway, so that they could free up their lives to be devoted to something meaningful and not just trying not to think about the end. So yeah, the vulnerability becomes the ground for further strength. This is, again, goes back to that very first point at the beginning of this. It's what's hard to teach people is that what's underfoot is not solid, but it's a web of paradoxes, and the paradoxes are the structure of reality. There is a good beginner Heraclitus book to start with. In fact, it's my favorite Heraclitus book. I know it's Kenneth Smith's favorite book on Heraclitus too. Give me a second, I'll give you the link. It's by Philip Wheelwright. It's called Heraclitus. It's from 1959, I think, and it is available for free download from the Internet Archive. And here is the link. Kenneth Smith's worked on a series of books about Heraclitus. They're just not finished yet. But and you know, that Heraclitus was the first. When I started studying philosophy with Kenneth, Heraclitus was the first philosopher I really got hooked on. I've got about 2.5 bookshelves full of translations of Heraclitus and writings about him. I still don't have everything, but I've got a lot of it. But if we can ever help Kenneth finish this book or the series of books he's working on, that'll be even better than Wheelwrights. But Wheelwrights is a good place to start, and it's very short. It's a very short book. I have the PDF on my computer. I usually have it open when we're doing these sessions, but for today, after reading the paragraphs we're going through, I decided I can probably do it from memory. So let's go to the second sentence, or at least the first clause of the second sentence, because the second sentence is long, and that's this one. The prospect of human communities, social, legal, political orders, ever becoming anything other than self-delusive and self-destructive, they, that is the ancients, the worldview we're describing in chapter 4, regarded as slim and precarious. So this gets closer to what I was saying before. That the form of their pessimism was not that it's impossible. They didn't think it couldn't be done. They just didn't know if they could do it. They didn't know if anybody could do it, but they pursued it. They worked on it, and they did what they could to try to protect it, to make it possible. You know, when why did Aristotle write the works that he wrote? Why did he write in that logical, calm way in which he would always start every book on a subject by going back to nature and saying, kata fusei, according to nature, what do we see on this subject? And then based on what we see on this subject, what can we conclude about the possibilities for whether it's ethics or metaphysics or politics or what have you? He would derive from that. Why would he even do that? Why would that be his approach? And it's because he's trying to create a reliable foundation for developing a pedagogy, right? He was a teacher. He was not primarily a writer. He was primarily a teacher. And he was trying to teach a group of people how to think philosophically, trying to digest and assess the philosophy that had come before and try to improve upon it and give it a better footing, make it less fantastic, less escapist in Kenneth's terms and more existentialist. And of course he's writing, we've mentioned before, he's writing at a time when the fall of classical Greece is apparent to everyone. I mean, it's apparent during the Peloponnesian War, which is why Thucydides is constantly referring back to the Trojan War. He's alluding back to it over and over so that people get the point that look at what we're doing. We're tearing it all apart. It's falling down right now around us. And when Thucydides wrote that, that was the time of Socrates. Socrates was actually a general in one of the engagements Thucydides writes about in the Peloponnesian War. He taught Plato. Aristotle learned from him. By the time Aristotle's writing, we've already gone through the problems with Sparta and Thebes and Corinth, and the disaster is not just coming, it came and went. Greece is a mess at this point. So he's trying to, does he think that he can reverse the course of history? Does he think that if people pay attention to what he's teaching, that they can turn back the clock? We have no way to know. He doesn't speak on that subject. But he's either trying to do that or he's trying to preserve what was good in what came before and pass it on so that it's not lost. Either way, he's engaged in a passing the torch activity, right? It's very much what you're talking about, Donna. He's focused on education here. And his school was the Lyceum. They were a peripatetic school. So they didn't sit and have him lecture while they listened. They walked. They went for walks together through the trees and through nature, and they would talk about what they saw and what had been happening and what it all meant, and try to weave together the ongoing experience with the lessons. The lessons thus were never canned or fixed. They were always adapting and flowing to what was happening around them. So we know there was an experiential component, but we don't know the full details. So here, Kenneth's saying this, the ancient perspective is you take this problem that people don't characterologically have this intrinsic love for the truth, and you work that up just like Aristotle does in his works. You work that up to the next level and say, from character comes culture and politics, right? The ways that we think help to shape and experience the world, help to shape the character that we carry forward with us. And the character that we have en masse, each of us has our characters, the combinations and interactions, the dominant patterns within that will generate the specific form of culture that we have and the specific form of governments to which we're suited or not suited. I can't remember which Greek writer it was who used to talk about, different Greek peoples not only had different forms of government, but they had to have different forms of government, because people can only be governed by the forms of government that can handle their character, and people have different characters. So one people might be well fit for democracy, and another people might be very poorly fit for democracy. They might require an aristocracy or even a tyranny. It all comes down to, can they rule themselves? In the politics, Aristotle makes these distinctions between the good and the bad forms of each form of government, and he distinguishes the good democracy from the bad democracy. And he says it comes down to the people that make it up. If they have the intrinsic love for the truth, if they are aristic, then you can have a democracy. But if they are not aristic, then it doesn't matter if you call it democracy. It's not. It's something else. It's a form of mob. The irony for us is that, for us, democracy is a good thing. For Aristotle, democracy was the word he used for the bad form. He had a different word he used for the good form. But it doesn't matter. The idea that there's a good and a bad form is the critical thing here. And he's saying, to have the good form, you have to have people who are characterologically fit to govern themselves, who don't just see voting as a way to club their neighbor over the head and get what they want. Who don't just try to get the majority to beat up on the minority, but who use the demos, the voting population, as an opportunity to triangulate on the truth and try to find together what the best thing is to do. That's the form of government, he says. That's the good one. That's, of course, not how we do things in the modern world. We much believe in the other model, which is, the majority rules. All right, the second half of the sentence, and these go relatively quick now, the rest of this paragraph. They're profound, but they're questions. Are human beings in general even competent to tell who is most fit to rule? I mean, are we even fit to vote for who should be in charge? Is that even what would be required? Kenneth is implying, there would be requirements. We would have to have a character and a background that made us fit to figure out who's right to be in charge. Are we even fit for that? To make critical decisions that bear on the justice and longevity of our societies. And when he's writing this, again, a reminder, he's not talking about what he thinks, he's talking about what the ancients thought. The purpose of this chapter is to get us to understand the ancient worldview and how different it is from ours. So in ours, of course people are fit. Democracy is how you do things. You get together, you have a vote, and the results of the vote are inherently the right answer. And then you do whatever that is, and that's how you run your society. And built into that are all kinds of assumptions that the ancients questioned explicitly. Who has the character that makes them fit to vote? Of the things that you're fit to vote on, are you fit to vote on who should be elected to do things, or are you not? Stephen says, Blackadder, do we give Baldric and Percy the vote? All kinds of questions to be asked. Can you make democracy be more than 6 lions and a gazelle voting on what to have for lunch? There needs to be more to it than the vote. The vote is perhaps. I worked for about well, at this point it's coming up on 3 decades in a committee that's responsible for developing standards for a programming language. And it moves the evolution of the language along by developing a new standard. And then the implementers implement a version of that language, and then that's what we use to program it, those implementations of the standard. And it's called the M Development Committee. M is the language. And the wisest folks who ran the MDC used to tell me, You don't ever want to bring a topic to vote on the floor of the MDC until you already know how the vote's going to come out. The vote should just be a signature at the end. It's not the meaningful part. The meaningful part is all the discussions that happen first. You got to talk to everybody and find out what they think. You got to find the best solution that everybody can accept. You have to know that it's the solution that we're all behind, and then you bring it to a vote. If you just chuck something out there, it's like gambling. You don't know if you're going to win or you lose, but either way, it's meaningless. It's like Shakespeare's tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. But in modernity, especially late stage modernity, we use the vote as a way to try to force our will on the other party that we don't agree with. And the last thing in the world we want to do is talk to them beforehand and come to an agreement, right? We want to beat them. We want to win through the warfare of voting. And this is a perfect encapsulation of what Aristotle warned against. You try to vote for who should be in charge in a context like that, and nothing good can come from it, except temporarily and by accident. All right, next sentence. And again, these are the point of this is to contrast over and over, contrast the modern take with the ancient take. So the ancients say, is not that individual most advantaged in politics who caters to popular delusion, who feeds people in the sucrose lies they're already determined to believe? As soon as democracy devolves into populism, who can seduce the most voters? You're guaranteed to get a kakistocracy. You will get the most conniving, manipulative types. They'll win because they know how to round up the large numbers required for a vote. It's like this subtlety of the difference between putting the emphasis on the vote versus putting the emphasis on the work before the vote to build a consensus. This is what's lost in translation. And it's such a subtle thing, it seems like, but it's the whole ballgame, according to Aristotle. It's literally everything. The difference between the best of all possible forms of government and the worst of all possible forms of government is, do you lose track and start to think that the vote is the point? Because once you do that, then you get these populists, these sociopaths who win. It all becomes about them and what they can do once they're in charge. Next sentence. Is there in any form of society a sufficient quorum of human beings fit to face the truth disinterestedly? In modern English, disinterested and uninterested, I'd say the majority of moderns don't think they're synonyms. They don't understand the difference between them. And the difference is everything. Uninterested means you don't care. Disinterested means you are capable of setting your personal interests aside to think about the greater good and what's the right thing to do. As Plato says that Socrates said, can you do justice to the rights of the question before you? A disinterested person can do that. An interested person cannot. An interested person is too distracted by their personal interests, and they'll want to warp the discussion to get their way to come out and win. So the Aristotelian good form of democracy is the one in which the voters are disinterested. They're not uninterested, they're very engaged, but they're capable of setting their interests and desires and wants aside and thinking about the greater good and working to build a consensus to figure out what the right solution is. But if they can't do that, you get the other form. Now, this gets particularly interesting when you realize that Aristotle into politics says, well, yeah, democracy, but the other two pairs are rule by a minority or rule by the one. Rule by a minority is either an aristocracy if the minority are aristoi, or it's an oligarchy if it's anybody else making up the ruling group. And an oligarchy is a disaster, one of the worst forms of government, whereas an aristocracy would be great because now you've got aristoi in charge. But, you know, if you can't get a majority of the entire population, can you at least get a majority of a small council fit to face the truth disinterestedly? And Aristotle says, frequently the answer is no, and you're stuck with an oligarchy, which is terrible. So, you know, this problem recurs on multiple scales. And then, of course, the issue of, monarchy versus tyranny, rule of the one versus rule of the tyrant. In a monarchy, what makes it a monarchy, according to Aristotle, is that it is an aristos who's in charge. That is someone fit, characterologically fit, and I don't mean me. That wasn't what that was about. Someone characterologically fit to face the truth disinterestedly. That person could be a monarch. Anybody else you appoint to the equivalent position is a tyrant. So Oedipus Tyrannus, the play that we mistranslate over and over as Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king, it's Oedipus the tyrant. Oedipus Tyrannus, the problem with Oedipus Tyrannus is he's not an aristos. This is what happens if you get a very, very smart, brave, a person full of virtues, but not an aristos in a position of government. Catastrophe is the result. The worst possible things that could happen. And they happen as a result of the strengths of the tyrant. The things they're good at are what bring about the disaster at every step of the way. And the whole play is about unwinding the past and discovering how that came to pass. It's already happened. The disaster's already occurred, but nobody knows it until the end of the play, when finally the whole scope of how we got here unfolds, and you realize that, yeah, this is the one guy who should not have married the queen of all the people in the world. Her son should not have married her, but it's a trail of errors, right, that led to that point. He could not face the truth disinterestedly. He's not an aristos. He's not capable of it. So even if you reduce the scale of the problem of this sentence to, can you even get one person into the right role to rule? Even if and Aristotle says, it's better to have the good form of democracy than the good form of monarchy. But can you even solve that problem? Can you even get one right person into the right place? And the answer is, well, most of the time societies don't. We just aren't organized right. And part of the reason for that is the worst personalities are the ones who most want to be in charge. They want it more than anything. If you're a whole human being with a healthy character, there's a variety of things you're interested in. But if you're really the wrong type of person, there's only one thing you want. You want power over everybody else because you think that's going to get you what you want. And so every time we're distracted by something else, like getting clean water to Flint, Michigan, there's somebody over there rigging the election to make sure that they're going to win so that they can be in charge, which they want more than anything. So these questions that he's asking here, we'll finish up in a moment, but let's let Stephen and Phil have a go. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was going to bring up the question of Phrynicus. Now, I disagree greatly with that idea that the sense of pessimism of the Greeks was connected with the stories of the Peloponnesian Wars and all that. I think it comes from the tragic period begins with Phrynicus. Now, he did the play, The Sack of Miletus, and expressed the truth that the Athenians didn't want to hear because they banned his play. The Athenians had supported the Ionian revolt and lost, and the Athenians must have asked, how can we lose? We are the good guys. That's impossible. Well, at the moment, the West is doing exactly the same thing in Ukraine. And if the answer comes up that the West has lost, they'll ban the play about it. So that was a play. I was wondering if you've heard of that. The Sack of Miletus.
No, but you've piqued my interest.
Shortly after the Ionian revolt, Phrynicus creates a play, and it seems that the audience went into spasms of terror and fear and crying, and it was too much for the virtuous Athenians, so they banned the play. Whereas by comparison, later on, the Persian emperor says, reminds me about Greece. But the Greeks don't want to be reminded about the Ionian revolt. Tell me what I want to hear.
Right.
I see it everywhere. Please tell me that my dreams will come true.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And of course, that's what Diogenes is doing with the lantern in the marketplace. He's saying these Athenians who pride themselves on being the pinnacle of Greece are obsessed with their own desires. And that's exactly the opposite of the heuristic personality. They are not being disinterested and ergo are not fit to govern. Thus, he's searching for even one honest man. Yeah, I'll follow up. I'll read up on Phrynichus. Sadly, his plays are gone; they're lost to history. But I'll do as much reading as I can to learn as much as I can about them. What you're describing is a critical point, and I want to underscore the part that you were saying towards the end, that although the Athenians thought they were superior to the Persians and had beat them in battle, the Athenians didn't want to hear about the shameful fall of Miletus. But the Persian emperor, who they held in contempt, did want to keep hearing over and over. He wanted to be reminded about the Greeks and what happened. So he was willing to think about and talk about his defeats and his catastrophes, but the Athenians weren't. And in that, you're right. I think you're right that I'm mistaking the origins of this, because you can sort of see the catastrophe coming when you see this character problem among the Athenians. The hypocrisy that we're going to read about in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, where we see the Athenians say, I know we say we stand for all these things, but actually do what we say or we'll, kill you. That's all, that hypocrisy is already alive and well at the time when they're banning the play, The Fall of Miletus. So, yeah, it's easy when we're talking about the past to oversimplify. We can say that the Greeks were very concerned about the problem of education, paideia, anthropoculture. But of course, what we really mean by that is some Greeks were concerned about these things, and other Greeks, whatever, they had other interests. They weren't paying attention. And there's always this struggle in any era between the ones who are trying to get us to pay attention to the fundamentals that we need to do to survive, and the ones who are like, whatever, I have other interests. I don't have time for that. It's not practical. There's always, in every culture, there are always great wrestling matches, tug of wars going on for what the culture is going to pay attention to out of its variety of different values that compete with each other. Anyway, thanks, Stephen. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you a kind of a personal story again. I think it actually relates to this. As you know, in the past 35, almost 40 years, I've been painting images, fallen angel. Remember, the background was one day I came home and I said I discovered the missing link. Talked to my roommate about it. And he was very interested. I said, the missing link is mankind. And that's because we might be struggling so hard to become human, and we are not human. We are, in fact, just fallen angels. Okay, so that's a background. Well, I have a doctor. I like the doctor very much. And in fact, I gave her one of my fallen angels. She loved art, and she loved it. It's hanging in her office. And a week ago, I went to see her, and I was thinking about the fog, because right there I was thinking about it. And when she finally appeared to give the consultation, I said, well, before we give the consultation, could I say something to you first? And I said, first thing I said was, I'm so sorry for what's happening to the women in Iran, right? You know, it's very tragic, just very hard to bear. And she said, yeah, we know, but it's almost impossible to fix. They almost have to fight for it themselves. And I said, you know, the reason why I mentioned this was that I was in the ante office and looking at the fallen angels, and I suddenly thought of something, and I thought I should tell you that, you know, like the fallen angels, of course, is fallen, but there's kind of, I suddenly saw that there was kind of within the fallen angel a bit of a hope. And I said, you know, like, and that came in the form of the Bodhisattva, a different culture, a different religion. But, you know, the Buddha, you know, the Bodhisattva actually evolved later than the Buddha. The Buddha is trying to reach enlightenment and attain the status of being in nirvana. But the Bodhisattva is quite different. It evolved later, but the Bodhisattva was a human being who had achieved Buddhahood. But instead of just like, oh, I'm out of here, I'm in nirvana now,
Right.
decided to come back and help the less fortunate, the less capable, to help usher them slowly or whatever speed toward enlightenment. I said, in a way, that's kind of what you're doing when you're a doctor. You're helping people along. And I thought about this when you were talking about governments. There are such people around. There are not so many, but they are around. And the problem is, like Buddha, they don't want to get involved in politics. Right?
Right.
I mean, helping people in the small way is fine. But to take on the role of helping a government that in some way that could help move society, whether you're going to become the aristocrat that rules, or whether you're part of the aristocracy or whatever, it's just so difficult because the proportion of fallenness so outweighs the human beings that has all achieved.
Right.
By the way, not that they have become angels. They still have wings, but they can't fly, but nonetheless, they desire to fly. And so I think that may be a problem, is because we are not evolved enough to actually become human beings. We are just part of mankind. And most of us are not able to be impartial because we are all, and I'll include myself in this, we are bound within ourselves to such a degree. It's hard to be indifferent and think about something that's greater.
Yeah.
In the whole structure. I don't know whether time will resolve that and whether we will even have enough time to get to that point when there's more and more numbers that could actually change the equation of being, able to be in that position of being, of think about. The problem we now have is because of the whole debt thing, is that we are not only hoarding the goal to ourselves, who are selfish, but we're hoarding the future generations. That's what the essential problem is that their future is more and more restricted. these people who didn't have a chance
Yeah.
to fight for their things.
Yeah.
It's going to be very restricted. So debt has also created a whole nother dimension of hoarding that has created even a deeper problem, because not only do we have to dig out this sort of divergence between the rich and the poor, but we now have to dig out the past from the future and rectify that.
Thank you, Phil.
So I think there is some equivocation in the fallen angel.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, they're a nice metaphor for equivocation. I can see why you seized upon them as a central theme of your art. So let's see. I think even though there's only 8 minutes left, I think we can wrap up section C today. Let's do the last 2 sentences of this paragraph. Does the human condition not tilt toward predation and mendacity generation after generation? That is, if we actually go back and look at our governments and our societies, do we have a lot of conspicuously virtuous and impressive leaders, or do we have an enormous number of people involved in kickbacks and scandals? And there is this problem. Modernity is not doing a successful job of leaning government to be more statistically often to come down on the side of being ruled by people who are paragons of virtue. We tend to get the other time after time. And of course, he's saying this is an ancient observation. This is the Greeks looking around the world around them and seeing tyrants and oligarchies and mobocracies, and saying we can't trust nature to give us good governments. This is one of those places where we have to exert our wills and try to do better. But of course, sadly, our wills are implicated in the problem through what we want. And is the historical life of a society anything other than the generationally compounded narcoses and irrealities of issues not tolerated or confronted, the unpaid balance to the account of corporate delusions? Corporate here not meaning corporations, but meaning the whole body of the people. So with these questions, he's basically just laying out the ancient concern, saying that the evidence doesn't show us naturally solving these problems. We've got to do something contranatural if we want to try to overcome this pattern, because otherwise this pattern keeps recurring. His final paragraph, this is where he pulls together sections A, B, and C. And this is the ancient perspective. Democracy will indeed be universal and healthy in any society where a mass of human beings are morally steeled to confront the most unpleasant truths, to gain control over their own narcotizing beliefs, and to live lives of philosophical austerity. Right? These are the Aristoi. This is a description of what Vernunft would involve, what an Aristos would be like. They would have these qualities. And the reason they would have these qualities is if they don't have these qualities, we can trace the lack of these qualities to one or another catastrophes in government that happen over and over and over throughout history. The Greeks find nothing paradoxical in their own practice of finite democracy. That is, self-rule restricted to characterologically qualified aristocrats. That is, Aristoi, not just oligarchs, among whom autarkia, which means self-rule, or self-determination, is an intuitive virtue that just comes naturally to them. Indeed, the Greeks see their own character as a people as anomalous for having such an ample body of aristocrats, perhaps a third of the whole people. Although in hindsight, looking at how Greek history ended up, the Peloponnesian War and elsewhere, I would say that, and I think Aristotle would agree, they confused a large number of oligarchs with aristocrats. They didn't have as many aristocrats as they thought they did. They had a lot of kind of class society would-be dominant people, and a lot smaller number of Aristoi than they thought that they had. And that explains a great deal about the course of their history, using their own model. Normally, such personalities are swamped by the culturally and politically depressive ocean of those who lack both insight and values. Right? Why does a Jesus get nailed to a cross? Why does a Socrates get fed a cup of hemlock? You know, you're pushing against a mighty tide if you're trying to get a population to stop behaving in self-destructive ways and to start, you know, start sacrificing in order to achieve the clarity of bitter truths. And yet it's necessary if the society is to thrive and survive. So this is the problem that the Greeks see. They believe that all of us, well, okay, let's put it this way. In modernity, we draw a sharp division between adult and child, and that division is an age. And when you hit that age, through a miracle, you stop being a child and you become an adult. And before that, you are 100% a child, and after that, you are 100% an adult. And that's the law. There's no gradual process of growing up and learning. All of that counts as childhood. And you don't vote, and you don't drink, and you don't serve in the military, et cetera. But the moment that date passes, all of your lessons are complete, and you have arrived, and you know you are now completely an adult. There's nothing really left to learn that's essential to being an adult. It's all just optional stuff. This is the law that modernity applies in almost all modern industrialized civilization nations that we have, which is fascinating because there's nothing realistic about it. You know, if you say it baldly like that, if you say, what is the law saying about the process of development of human maturity? It sounds like a joke. It's absurd, but that is literally structure of the law. Now, the law tries to compensate for itself by putting in various kind of corrections and opportunities for judges to, you know, take things into account or not. But all of that is just trying to, you know, that's trying to shore up a structure that obviously doesn't fit reality. What the Greeks are saying is, you know, most people are not adults by the standards that would be required for what Aristotle describes as a healthy form of democracy. Most people are incapable of setting aside their own desires and interests enough, and at the same time caring about the outcome to agree to collaborate to try to come up with, you know, solutions that don't serve them personally, that might not please them personally. Most people lack the capacity. Ergo, by this analysis, by this ancient analysis, most people are not adults and therefore are not fit to govern. Now, to say that they're not fit to govern doesn't mean that you trample them. You should be, you know, trying to give them whatever authority that they can manage. And you should be certainly paying attention to, you know, their complaints and their problems and their needs. But to let somebody be president whose primary goal is to rip everybody else off, what do you expect the outcome to be? You can't just say, well, we ran the process of the election and it came out this way, and ergo, he is the one who should be in charge. That's a modernist, mechanistic, amoral way to solve a problem. It completely ignores the goals of government, the purpose of government, why we even bother to organize into societies. But that's how we do things in the modern world. The ancients would have said that was insane, just completely insane. It's not that the ancients are paragons of virtue who get everything right. That's not the point being made here at all. It's that they see the world. They see human nature, society, history, the gods. They see everything differently than we do. Their value system is different. Their analysis is different. What they think matters or doesn't matter is different than we do. So the kinds of governments that they would like to form are different. They aren't able in their own history to fully bring about the things that they wish that they could do. Because like any people, there is a massive momentum sweeping them along from the past, right? So maybe by the time of Aristotle, Aristotle can be saying, there are people who are currently slaves who perhaps would be better off being in charge of us because they have eristic personalities. And there are people who are in charge of us who have the personalities of slaves and really shouldn't be in charge because all they can think about is feathering their own nest. And that's not appropriate for somebody who's running government. He can be saying that the class society is out of sync with their ideals about how government ought to work. But he can't do anything about it to change it because there's too much momentum. So when we read the Greeks, it's important that we read them in this context, that by the period of the late ancient period, people understand a great deal about the problems that they're in, but that they nevertheless can't change or do anything about. And so we're not going to find in Athens or Sparta or Corinth or Thebes or any of these other places, or Rome, we're not going to find them perfectly bringing their theories to bear. We're going to see them struggling against their own internal momentum and friction, and only managing sometimes to get some parts of their ideas into practice. Which means that, although Kenneth is oversimplifying it here for purposes of just trying to be readable, I think he would agree that at its foundation, it means that, as people sometimes say about Marxist communism, so too the ancient concept of aristeia and aristocracy was never exactly tried by the ancients. They kept trying to try it, but they kept not managing to pull it off. They kept going over, they kept hamartia, they kept missing the mark over and over. Just like many, many would-be communist countries end up becoming dictatorships rather than doing anything that Marx actually asked them to do. It's part of what makes the science of politics and the science of history so difficult, is that it's easier to think about this stuff in bumper sticker slogans than it is to understand the complexities of the mismatches between what people are trying to do and what they actually accomplish. So Geneva asks, would Kenneth agree that as moderns we are doing the same thing, wrestling with ideas and concepts to try to get closer to something that's right? Yeah, I mean, certainly you could say that our ideals for the perfect economy or the perfect politics have never actually been carried out in any government. We see, again, just fragmentary aspects of it. As Stephen says, you can't handle the truth. It's right, we haven't actually managed to bring these things to bear. And so as part of what makes philosophy a difficult discipline, and going back around to Phil's very first point, it's what makes it hard to explain any of this stuff. You're trying to teach students this stuff. Part of what you have to teach them is, okay, here's our beliefs, and we didn't actually ever do any of that. We did these other things instead. They didn't work out so well. And that doesn't tell us whether our beliefs would have worked out well or not. But we can all we can do is say how much of what we tried matched up with what we thought we should do. And those are the parts that we maybe partially successfully tested. And the rest of it remains untested. Big gaps between our ideals and our practice. So next time we move on to section D. We have wrapped up our section here on form and matter, organicism, and arete. And section D, arete or natural excellence. Ooh, this is an interesting section. I'm really looking forward to talking about it with you all next time. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a point about Descartes.
Please.
His point was that how can we trust our own mental machinery? We have a guarantee. Thank God there is a God. Okay, we've moved on. All the smart people in the world have decided this all-powerful, perfect guarantor of your existence doesn't exist.
Right.
We've moved on to Max Stirner and Nietzsche saying what comes after God is dead. We've just shot the guy who was supposed to be the guarantor that our existence had some significance. The point was, okay, you're a human being, you have your limitations, but a good God would not have created a world where you can only fail. He's not a demiurge. Okay, you've assassinated God, you guys. I want to think, how can you be sure any longer that your mental machinery simply doesn't involve you peeing in the wind? Chaos.
Right. Before I address that, Joseph just reminded me that I'm an hour earlier than I think I am. We've got another hour to go. We're a 3-hour session, not a 2-hour session. So this week we get to dive into section D, not next week. We're going to do it. So thanks, Joseph. I I lost track of time. So going back to what Stephen said, yes, one of the great ironies of modernity is that the basis of rationality, rather than God or nature, it will be rationality that is what's going to guide us, human reason, and the guarantor of human reason is God, who created us, and therefore would never have made us have a reason that doesn't work. He would have to have given us intelligence that's functional, right? But as modernity developed, a strong streak of atheism began to develop. And the problem is when you add atheism to the modernist faith and rationality, what you get is human rationality, but now without the guarantee that God made our rationality correctly. If there's no God, then how do we know where is this promise that rationality is supposedly a good bet to run an entire epoch of civilization off of? And as Stephen's pointing out, the answer is, yeah, that's sort of the rug being pulled out from under the entire justification of modernity. And so what does modernity have to say about that? And the answer is, let's not talk about it. Modernity's answer to this problem is, the less said, the better. I got things, I hear my mother calling. I hear my market calling. Something busy is happening. I need to look away from this problem, which is that we have painted ourselves into a corner where our own justification for our entire framework of civilization and worldview has become incoherent. It no longer makes sense. But we'd rather not talk about that. It's deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic kind of activity, right? It's like being in a house that's on fire but not wanting to interrupt your poker game because it's really going well. It's like at some point you sort of need to turn and face the fundamentals, the foundations of why you're doing any of this, and ask yourself, is this really a good idea? And as we like to think that because of the concept of progress, we like to think that because we came after previous epochs, that we are more advanced than previous epochs. We like to think that and when I say think, I'm really brutalizing the word think. We like to assume that we are the pinnacle of evolution or creation or history or whatever. And that ergo, if previous civilizations were philosophical, we must be even more philosophical because we came later. We must be the philosophicalist of all philosophical philosophizers because, modernity is better at everything than everybody before. The problem is, as Kenneth keeps pointing out, when you look at our relationship to these fundamental questions, like the one that Stephen just raised, time after time, what we do, instead of grappling with them as a people and saying, yes, let us grapple with this question and talk about what it means, what are the guarantors of human rationality, and is this a good basis? We go, let's not talk about it. We really, over and over, modernity's answer is it's best not to talk about it, really. It's ineffable. Just trust that it works. Don't think too much about it. And in that, it's reminiscent of Cicero writing about ethics and opening up his book on ethics by apologizing for philosophizing and saying, I know philosophy is evil and nobody's ever supposed to do it. Thinking should only ever be practical, but I assure you that philosophy is practical and virtues are practical, and I'll demonstrate that in this book to make it okay for me to be allowed to write this book. The Romans were so anti-philosophical. And in that, Kenneth Smith argues, we see the ways in which modernity has modeled itself on late stage Rome, because we too are deeply anti-philosophical. Now, we don't send some guy with a sword to, stab you the way that the Romans would sometimes do if you engaged in if you committed philosophy. What we do is we sideline you, right? If you want to philosophize, well, you can do that, but it better be on your own time as a hobby. And we're mostly going to ignore it. If you try to make a living doing it, well, then you're going to be poor. And poverty in modernity is how we punish people. We don't need to send a guy with a sword. It's because if we send a guy with a sword, you can point to the guy with a sword and say, look, you're oppressing me. But if all we do is suck the money out of your life so that you can't afford anything, we hardly know who to point at. It's hard to figure out how you fight back or what you object to exactly. So the market is very good at stratifying to make sure that, potentially disruptive elements find themselves with less power and therefore less able to be disruption. And that includes philosophers. Donald, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe try and emphasize a little bit more this idea of Greek education.
Please.
as a way in which we are different. And I tend to think, well, we have paideia. The Greeks, education, I guess you could say it's centered on the child, but it's certainly not controlled by the child. It's the adults that decide what the child should learn. The curriculum is set by not me, if not those who know, at least those who should know better or whatever, I mean, there's nothing that I've ever read that says, well, let's let the children play and see what they're interested in. No, we know what they're interested in. They've got eight declensions and I don't know how many conjugations and whatever. They've got a lot to learn to master Greek. They've got to learn their mathematics. They've got to learn to play the lyre and the flute. They've got this, why do we call it classical education? It's they have their subjects and everybody gets to learn them. They've got to read Homer. They've got a lot of things to get done. And I think what I draw from that is, to some extent, modernity is what? Lost confidence. To me, it's an indication that modern society largely has lost confidence in what it knows and what needs to be taught. Because we can't agree on any kind of curriculum that would produce a modern member of our society. And that to me, it's not what the content of that curriculum might be, but just structurally that we don't know and therefore can't prescribe by the time they're 18 or whatever our age of majority or however we're going to determine the beginning of adulthood. I don't think, that's why we do it by 18. It's simple. People, if they take off their shoes, they can count that. I guess, and this just indicates to me it's a real indicator of that we've lost knowledge or lost confidence or don't know. I mean, I know there are curriculum fights all the time, and we're in a period of curriculum fights, but none of the fights are about this. It's about whether they should there be sex education books in the school library or
Right.
Or should we have advocacy for various political agendas inculcated in the schools or something like that? But they don't have anything in, look, this is something, if we're going to be a successful society, even we're not a democracy we're kind of the Republican United States. By that, I mean divided powers, multiple layers of government, checks and balances. There's not much understanding taught about how that might work, how it might ameliorate or mitigate against the real idiots that want power. And I mean by idiots, the people whose concentrate solely on themselves. They focus on achieving power. How that might be blocked if we kept some of these structures and processes from our Constitution. Now, not that I won't defend all of them or attack all of them, but right now, it seems we're largely in a situation where most citizens don't even know how they would work if they did work. And so they have no interest and no judgment other than, you know, I don't know what kind. I hear two camps. It's against they're trying to destroy our democracy, or they're trying to restrict the vote. Well, you know, these are slogans, and I don't know. And here we've seen, hey, looking at the Greeks might say, oh, restricting the democracy might be okay in certain circumstances. Certain people haven't done their homework. Or if we're not going to do that, we might ought to look at this layered democracy of representative government and how it weans out things. Maybe it wouldn't work. I don't know. We don't try it very much anymore. So, you know, it's let's have a vote. You want us to resolve this issue? Let's vote. Let's not resolve this issue and build consensus for what we think is a real resolution. That's not going to happen. I think of this a lot. I mean, Kirsten Sinema, the great destroyer of American democracy, according to her own party, is one that says, hey, if we stopped having votes and started talking to each other, we might get better legislation. Now, it's true, we might not, but it's hard for me to see how we could do worse.
Right.
You know, and I like Phil, and Phil's coming up. And I want to say that his friend Plato, more than Aristotle, was fighting on multiple fronts. He targeted in his dialogues a lot more enemies of the state than maybe Aristotle. You know, he tried to explain frogs and flowers and trees and a lot of other stuff. But Plato's got the sophist in his sights, in like Gorgias and Protagoras. I'm watching you. He's got the oligarchs, the people, you know, he wants people to understand the 30, the oligarchy. He's got Charmides and Critias come up. He's got really, in terms of philosophy, he's got just kind of idiots. There's like Nicias, who's a kind of an aristocrat, but really he got to be a general, but he didn't know anything about being a general. There's a story that the Spartans, when one of their allies would request help, would send a single Spartan soldier. You know, David Mamet did a movie it's called Spartan, where there's actually one guy and he changes everything. But the Spartans sent to Syracuse after Athens sent, 45,000 men or something and 100 ships to take Syracuse. And they were encircling the city. And the Syracusans, they couldn't figure out how to stop this because they were building this wall. And this guy, this young Spartan general comes there and he says, build walls perpendicular to their walls, radial out from the city, and see if they can get around all that stuff. And they couldn't. It was one man stopped the encirclement dead with a very simple idea,
Yeah.
and ended up getting a lot of Athenians killed. I mean, he really did. So I like that. Nicias was the head of that. That's why I think of that. He was the general that led that invasion. And of course, Plato had his own thing, like Aristotle had Alexander. Is that Plato tried to deal with Dionysius of Syracuse, tried to educate him. He didn't. It didn't work. He didn't work as he never even developed Alexander's, I don't know, practical psychology of knowing how to seduce a king rather than defeat a king, get him to become your vassal. Well, I think I rambled enough, but to me, it's really this idea of education, how represents to me a very fundamental problem that we have. We just, they're just constant fights, and I'm not sure who should win, but but the Greeks have a lesson here for us. If we don't know what things we need to know in order to preserve our civilization, chances are we're not going to preserve it.
Yeah. Thanks, Donald.
Thank you, Rick, and I look forward to hearing from Phil.
Yeah, let's do that. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, I think it was yesterday. I was in a meetup group that discussed the history of the dialectic with Herbert Marcuse. And we were discussing Plato, Aristotle, and then Stoics, and then Plotinus. And become very interesting. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because, like, perhaps we're piling on a little too much to modernity. Okay, that yes, modernity could certainly take some of the blame, but the blame started a long time ago in this sense. Now, think about Plato. I mean, Plato didn't have a solution. He talked about really the forms or the ideas versus its manifestation, and that ontological difference was the state that we're living in, and we have to struggle through it. It was an aspiration. And the problem with an aspiration such as Marxism or any kind of thing is that the ideal, on the other hand, you have to make some judgment about its manifestation. You can't just say, well, Marxism didn't work because there were, corrupt people and always became a autocracy, right? Because if you think about Russia, you think about China, you think about Cuba, you think about Cambodia, you think about Venezuela, like, okay, we are concerned about the manifestation, not just the ideals, right? You just can't have a string of things that said, it's all good. We still have the ideals. And so that's always been a problem in this sense, and that's not to say there isn't a problem in democracy, all right? And what I meant to say is when we got to Plotinus, it struck me there's something that was very interesting. Plotinus took Plato and saw it, well, I think he believed it was an aspiration, but he saw that there was something else that in that aspiration, there was an essence. Okay, you could say Plato had an essence of the form, was trying to get to. And that essence, in a sense, you could ascend perhaps to some kind of absolute, which Plato never thought it was possible. Plotinus did, and to whatever degree it was inspired by a mystical thinking, don't know. But I want to get to the next step, which we, in a way, did. Well, we sort of touch on it, but we didn't get into, which is Augustine, right? Augustine took Plotinus and instituted, and I immediately went to the two Bibles, the Old Testament Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and the Christian Bible. And this is how the Hebrew Bible began. In the beginning, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. That sounds a little bit like the Egyptians to me, in a way, right? In other words, it came from an unfolding of something that was nature. Well, he made it, but nonetheless, it unfolded from some sort of mystery, okay? And it manifested in actuality from God's power. By the time we got to Aquinas, and this is from John, in the Greek beginning was the word. You could say logos, okay? In the beginning was logos. And the logos was with God, and the logo was God. Seemed like a big change. Seemed like logic was with God and logic was God. So the essential God that's about existence was already half dead. So the moderns took the logos part and forwarded it down and killed God altogether. So you can't blame God is dead just on modernity. He was already dead, nailed to the cross, so to speak, because what was left was logos. I mean, it wasn't a creation. It was, how should I say, maybe you could call it a meditation. I'm not quite sure, but that's a big, big switch.
It's huge.
And you can't blame that on just modernity somehow.
Right.
Putting it on logos.
Right.
It was already there, certainly with Augustine.
Oh, yeah.
Probably with Plotinus as well, but nonetheless, certainly with Augustine. So please don't just say modernity killed God. He was already nailed on the cross, half dead. So I just want to bring that up. Don't pile it on. Give modernity the blame.
I'm going to pile it on, Phil.
But there's a history that that's in there, okay?
You know I'm going to pile it on.
All right.
But I agree with you that it didn't start with modernity, right? The bud, the blossom, and the fruit. Modernity is an unfolding of what was already underway. I agree with you 100%. I agree with you 100%. Yeah. We're just clarifying a few things, just like medievalism just clarified a few things. Each of these epochs does its own filtration and clarification and reinterpretation.
Well, clarification is different from piling it on.
Yeah. But in that clarification, modernity reveals things about human nature and human history that we couldn't see as clearly before because they were obscured, as Kant complains, by tradition and other irrational things that are interfering with our ability to see how we're thinking. You know, how does Verstand work? Can't see it as clearly when you're buried under all those other things. Bye, Geneva. So, you know, part of the reason to pile on modernity is really just to get a clear, is because we're really piling on some part of our own nature that modernity is revealing for us in a way that we couldn't see before. You know, the whole God is dead thing, Nietzsche, of course, is really talking about that we had become so banalsified, so ordinarized and mechanistic in our relations to one another and to the church, that there was nothing of the sacred left in our forms of worship. And that we'd already killed the sacred and our ability to recognize it just through our banal ways of life and our banal interpretations of the sacred, which stripped from it all the sacred qualities. You know, everything worthy of being worshipped had been removed, and what had been left was habit and, you know, economics and politics and other very ordinary human things. That was his real concern. But of course, as you say, modernity did not invent that, right? That's been an issue going back for quite a ways. All we did was turn that up to 11, right? We just routinized it because religions have a way of volatilizing power relations, right? I mean, Joan of Arc, right? Illiterate peasant girl inspired by God swings the course of a major war. That's too risky for modernity. Modernity doesn't want to have any truck with that sort of thing. So religion had to be ordinarized so that it would not inspire any more Joans of Arc, and, you know, thus we wouldn't have to worry about peasant revolts disrupting our our tidy contracts and economic relationships. There is a longing for predictability at the heart of modernity that's so intense in its yearning that it can't stand to have any competition from things like God's. I mean, anybody who got up early on a Sunday morning as a kid and watched the televangelists at work could learn something profound about what modernity does to religion. That popularization used specifically as a way to acquire cash is, especially in that remarkably transparent form, there's a whole education there. And granted, if most people were like me, you know, you watch a few minutes of that and you're like, something's wrong here, and I would rather watch Roadrunner cause an anvil to fall on Wile E. Coyote's head. I think I'm just going to turn this channel. I can't take any more of this. But that was a mistake on my part as a child. I didn't understand that the thing I was turning away from was the real lesson. There's a tremendous amount to be learned from that. Joseph, go ahead. Oops, I just muted you again.
No, sorry about that. Just a really quick question, actually, in a way. If we don't have this love for the truth, you know, or something like this, aren't these like habits or these like kind of rituals, shall we say, then the next step as a way of a shortcut to kind of try and control a populace, essentially? Does that make sense?
Say that again.
So, like, essentially, do rituals and religions become like a shortcut towards controlling populations if, you know, people are unwilling to accept the truth or really search for truth, or, you know, essentially search for true wisdom? You know, that then, like, the rituals actually, which is dangerous. I'm not arguing in favor of one. Believe me, I'm fully aware of the dangers of ritual and not understanding the what is behind it. But essentially, isn't that like just a natural evolution of essentially people that are unwilling to search for truth?
You know,
Does that make sense?
It does. I see what you're saying. In traditional Okinawan martial arts, first you learn the pattern of a kata before you know what it's for. You follow along and you develop the habit of the ritual of performing it. And then once you've got the habit, there are all these other aspects of kata that we can now teach you about, like, you know, the form, you know, where exactly do you hold your hand? Yes, you gesture this way, but you don't gesture wildly, you gesture in a controlled way. We start to teach you how to refine and tune up your moves. And we start to teach you why. You know, what is this move really? What are you really doing here? What is the meaning of it? And you can learn it because you have the habit already to refer back to over and over. The habit creates an object of the mind that you can recreate whenever you want to, and then look at and assess and go, oh, you're right, I did move my arm too far. And then, you know, you could start doing partner work and find out, you know, if the guy brings in a slow punch and you do that same move, did you time it right? Did you actually block it? Or did you just wildly gesture your arm and then he punched you because you didn't actually put it in the right place? You know, there's all this increasing complexity and intricacy that they can add to the understanding, and not just detail, but depth. Why do we do any of this? What is this all about? You know, after you've learned a few kata, we can teach you the principle that there's no first strike in karate. You don't start by attacking. And the first thing we teach you about that is the reason is because karate is an art of peace, not an art of war. It's about ending the fight, not starting a fight. And so you can't be the aggressor. The other guy's the aggressor, and then you do what you can to, with minimal harm to both of you, end the fight and get back to peace. And that's an important lesson about values. But it's because you already know 2 or 3 katas and you can look at them and you say, oh, that's right. They all start with a block, don't they? In every case, we're blocking to start with. Huh, that's interesting. You scratch your head and think, well, what does that mean? But then at the advanced level, we teach you that the reason that you don't start with an attack is that the deeper karate that you start learning as a black belt isn't about punches and blocks and kicks. It's like more like judo or tai chi. It's about the other guy attacks and he has given you the gift of his arm or leg, and what are you going to do with that gift? Well, you could escort it to the ground or into this wall, or, you know, move it behind him and lock him up so that he can't fight. Whoever puts their aggression out first is giving the tool necessary to defeat themselves to their opponent. The reason there's never a first strike in karate is the one who strikes first is an idiot who's going to lose the fight as long as his opponent knows traditional Okinawan martial arts. You know, there's these stories about Musashi or other great samurai coming to a bridge and being all full of pride, but there's a samurai coming the opposite direction at the other side of the bridge, and each one wants the other one to step aside and, okay, we're gonna have a fight. All right, you go first. The other guy's like, oh no, you go first. They're just standing there looking at each other like, okay, which of us is going to be enough of an idiot to draw first, because that guy's going to lose. And eventually they're like, fine, neither of us will cross the bridge, we'll both leave. Because they know, they're at that level where they know whoever goes first loses. They've extended themselves into something they never should have started, and the other guy's going to be able to defeat them using what they've put out there. So, you know, you can't teach somebody that lesson if they've never done a kata or never practiced karate. You can't just intellectually put that into somebody's head because it doesn't make sense. Why would the big, strong guy who throws the punch be the one to lose, right? How can that possibly be true? You just have to see over and over. You can block the attack, and after you get good at blocking attack, you can capture the attack and get arm control on the guy, and you can throw him or lock him up or stop him. The whole mistake was the punch in the first place. The only way to learn that is by going through the experience. There's just no other way to do it. So I think that's what it's like with what you're talking about, that ritual can be done in such a way that it's a thought terminating cliche that shuts down creativity and inquisition into the world. But it can be done the other way, like it is in traditional Okinawan martial arts. And I think in many other disciplines as well, where first you learn the ritual because they're easy to learn. You can just memorize the sequence. But once you've got the sequence, you can then add layer after layer to it and show them deeper truths that are only visible now because of the sequence. I think that was what religion was trying to be in the ancient world. I think about too how, related to this, how the medieval Orthodox Church didn't want to let the lay people read the Bible directly. And they said, you need experienced priests interpreting the word of the Bible for you. And, you know, in leading up to the Reformation, the initial reaction was, well, but you guys are all corrupt. We can't trust you. We need to read it for ourselves, right? Who are you to stand between us and God? Perfectly reasonable argument, right up until you start handing the Apocalypse of John to people. And next thing you know, they're all in doomsday cults thinking the world's going to end any moment. And there's the medieval priests going, oh my God, we warned you. This thing is a mess. It has all kinds of wisdom, but it's dangerous. And you really need people to help you understand what the hell this is about. Because if you take it literally, it's so easy to misunderstand. Just like when the Okinawans took karate into Japan and taught the Japanese karate for the first time, the Japanese thought that karate was about punching and kicking and blocking. They didn't understand that it was about capturing the attack and rerouting it. That whole art stayed behind in Okinawa. It didn't become part of Japanese karate. They didn't understand the thing that they'd been given. So it is with ritual and religion, I think. You know, if it's done right, it becomes this foundation ritual becomes this foundation that's really handy for building deeper lessons. But if it's not done right, then it becomes a thought-terminating cliche, and they're stuck. So it's a great point, Joseph. Thank you for bringing that up. Donald, go ahead.
Well, Musashi's a very interesting man.
Yes.
I don't know. I was fascinated. I read some translation of his book, and he has, you know, a few pages in there about how to sword fight. And he basically says, you know, stand with your feet shoulder width apart and grip your sword and hold it centered in front of you. There are only 6 possible attacks. Each one has a counter. At the appropriate time, kill your opponent. But you have to stand there calmly, recognize the attack, and counter immediately. He says, if you attempt to block the attack, you will be too slow and you will die.
Right.
You must fearlessly kill the opponent in the middle of his attack, knowing that his sword will fall harmlessly out of his hands because he's dead. And I just thought, well, great technique there, guy. You know, I guess I'm not going to be a sword fighter.
Whoever attacks first reveals what strategy needs to be used to defeat them. That's the problem. Nobody wants to go first.
Right. But being calm enough, even as a swordsman, to let the opponent reveal, because that sword is like a quarter, a half of the way to you.
Oh yeah, it's coming at you.
And then you say, oh, I know what to do. Wham, and it's over.
Right.
But I don't know. He says that he learned his humility when he was young and didn't know how to sword fight, I think. That he was rude to some old man or old woman walking down a road, and they had their walking stick, sort of a 5-foot staff, and they beat him pretty badly. He had his sword, and they took their stick and beat him. And then he said he began to learn how to fight.
Yeah.
Or the whole art.
Yeah.
You know, which was getting this inner calmness that'll let you do it.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting stories about Musashi Miyamoto there. He's one guy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I recommend the 3 movies that were made of his life are excellent.
Yeah, that trilogy is among the highest rated of the
Yeah,
Trimbara
it
films.
is. It is, and it's interesting. His final big fight, he uses his katana to carve a stick out of the boat's oar, with which he defeats his opponent. So his career began by getting beat with a wooden stick, and he ends his career by carving him a wooden stick to beat what proved to be the second best swordsman in Japan.
Yeah. 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 Yep. Martial arts are interesting that way.
Yeah, it's all
All up here, right?
Yeah, that's like what Gorbachev said. It takes a little something up here.
I see what you did there.
Well, that's a joke about George H.W. Bush's vice president, who got a tattoo,
Yes.
up there after Gorbachev gave him that advice.
Yes. Dan Quayle.
Dan Quayle. Dan, you need a little something up here.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting, this issue that, part of what's underlying this kind of training is the idea that people don't understand how much of their behavior is motivated out of fear. They think that they're not afraid, but that's because they don't even recognize that they're flinching, and that all their thoughts are bent around the thing that they're afraid of. And the idea that the only way to win is to let the attack come at you long enough to figure out what it is. Obviously you have to develop speed in recognizing what it is, but no matter how fast you are, you have to let the attack come at you a certain ways before you know what it is. And if you try to respond before that point, you're going to do the wrong thing. So yeah, you develop your reflexes, you try to get the speed such that with the time that's left over after that, you still have enough time to get out of the way and do the right thing. But aside from that, just the psychological idea of, I see that it's coming, but I don't yet recognize it, and I need to give it more time. I need to let it get closer to hurting me. This is like, I'm telling you, at a really basic limbic level, none of us wants to learn that lesson. Our instincts are all, no, jump now.
Well, this comes back a bit to what you said about the Eleusinian mysteries.
Yes.
To remove the fear of death.
Yes.
Do you have some reference on that, or did I miss it in the chat? Anything? There was some late Roman or very late Greek that wrote about the mysteries. Nobody from that classical period, so it might be suspect.
Just the guy who got busted for spilling the beans.
Yeah, but I've not ever read any of that. But Socrates, as Plato presents him, makes a big deal that you really can't be, you can't freely choose what to do. If it's, well, that'll affect my next paycheck, or I might lose my life if I do this. It's the one big thing. It's the basis of all ethics, really. Yeah. You must remove the fear.
Right.
So that you can act.
Right.
And I would be interested in if you have if you get back to any reference at some time on the Eleusinian mysteries, but
yeah, I'll think about it. I'll try to remember where I read about this.
Yeah, I've read more kind of secondary stuff, and oh well.
Well, that's because the primary stuff is all, nobody's allowed to say anything, the end.
Right.
There's our primary references. Shut up.
Okay, we'll let Steve.
All we have is secondary references. But yeah, there are some secondary references written by witnesses to it who said, and I'll see if I can remember who that was. Steve, go ahead.
Okay, in discussing martial arts,
Yeah.
You've come up to what I was trying to say about Gleipnir. Still haven't quite figured it out, but there you are. There's the
Okay.
trick. I mean, Vikings must have had their martial arts as well.
They did.
But bringing up the question of the truth, you've hit on it again with, say, the book of Revelation. When they see the countenance of the Lord, the truth, they beg the mountains should bury them. Please, we don't want to see the truth. Let the mountains bury us. Let us have the worst fates imaginable other than seeing the truth. This is what the book of Revelation is telling us. And again, in existential philosophy, it gets pointed out, you'll know that you've hit the truth, you'll know that you've hit reality when it makes you sick, when you experience nausea. Because if you ever experience truth in your life, it's going to burn. It's not going to be pleasant. But our whole world wants a version of the truth which is pleasant, or what we know as the lie. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Some of them were profound. Of the classical myths talk about this idea that you can't gaze upon the truth nakedly or to drive you insane. Because we're finite and it's infinite, right? The cosmos, by comparison with us, the cosmos is infinite, and it's infinite in many dimensions at the exact same time. So it's almost an infinity of infinities that boggles the mind, and not in petty details, but in the things that matter. It's like it's meaningfully infinity of infinities, and this idea of such a profound mismatch between our rationality and the cosmos that it's supposed to give us a handle on is extremely disturbing. Horror writer H.P. Lovecraft did a whole subgenre of horror exclusively about the collapse of your worldview when you're confronted with reality, a reality that's totally different from what you thought it was, that you're wholly unprepared for. He was a science enthusiast. He loved cosmology, and he knew that our little parochial worldviews were no match for this vast cosmos that is not interested at all. Yeah, he's famous for coming up with, and almost nobody gets this when they do their pastiches of Lovecraftian horror. He's famous for coming up with objects of fear like Cthulhu, these great old ones, these ancient, beings that aren't evil in any sense that we would recognize because they aren't interested in us. It's like the devil's very interested in us. He wants to seduce us and fool us and get us to sign a contract. And Lovecraft's like, that's so petty. Lovecraft's saying Cthulhu doesn't even know we exist. Like, Cthulhu is well adapted to this infinite cosmos, and to us, he's incomprehensible to us. It takes no concern of us. The great tragedies that happen when our lives intersect the lives of these great old ones in Lovecraft's horror are not the result of their intention to harm us. It's of our incompatibility with reality. We're just not prepared, and reality just grinds over us, and we're shocked that it didn't turn out well. And he didn't always succeed in portraying that well, but he was trying to show what Stephen's talking about, about the nature of the truth. It's like that issue. How do you come, that we talked about at the beginning? How do you come to develop what Kenneth Smith wrote about, an intrinsic love for the truth? Through pain. You develop that through painful experiences. It burns to learn the lessons that lead you to hold in contempt the part of yourself that loves falsehood, and to become a hunter of it, to seek it out and try to eradicate it so that you can get closer to the truth. I mean, it hurts. It's the only way. And that pain, that burning pain, becomes the dynamo that powers the development of the love for the bitter, clear truth. They're directly related. So we've kind of come full circle here at the end. Thank you, Stephen. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah. Since we're talking about martial arts, I have seen the Samurai trilogy. And I was very interested, particularly in the third one. He was battling Kojiro, who supposedly is the best swordsman in Japan. And I want to contradict what you said about the first strike. Okay. And in fact, Musashi did the first strike. They had an appointment, you could say the gunfight at high noon or whatever. They were supposed to meet at a certain time. And Kojiro was a very, how to say, very social man who believed in customs and so forth. And Musashi came late, quite late to the battle, because he knew the way that defeat Kojiro was a psychological battle, not actually a martial arts battle. And he knew that he would put Kojiro in such a state of being just angry that this guy actually didn't keep his appointment because he was in the boat carving his staff, right? So that was the first strike because he broke the system. And I'm going to recommend another movie that's very interesting. This guy was a very, very good swordsman. It's called The Sword of Doom. A very, very good movie. Well, it reveals the culture, but it also says something about the filming technique. I mean, the way the battles are taken are just incredible. Okay, this guy was a young man. He was kind of a bit of a jerk, but he was just a very accomplished. And of course, back in those days, one of the ways to become recognized as a great martial artist, a great swordsman, was to challenge the various schools to show you were better than they are. Okay? And so he would go to these various schools. And of course, when you go to a school, there was a system, a custom. Who the hell are you to go challenge our master, right? You have to prove you're worthy, okay? So you end up fighting one of the students. You'll defeat him handily. Of course, that doesn't get you the win with the master, the fight with the master, the duel with the master. So you move up the ladder, and finally you move up to a very high rank of students, and then finally, the whatever. So by the time you get to the master, you're so fucking exhausted that you can't fight him. This is the part of the problem with Japan, not only Japan, but modern society.
Yeah.
You want to fight the system, but in order to get to it, you have to go through so many levels of bureaucracy and this and that and the whatever. I learned this, by the way, when I'm in India. Like, you go and complain and you say, "Oh no, we don't handle this." Go to Department X. Go to Department X. No, we don't. So they got the British system except they just had, they don't. Nobody takes any responsibility. You finally decided, oh fuck, it's not that important.
Right.
Right?
Wears you out.
That's right. You win. Like,
Problem solved.
I thought it was like a really important thing. It turned out it's not so important after all. So you just give up. And I think that's part of the problem of a very complex society. All complex society have this. Because you're not going to meet the head guy when you just walk in. Who the hell are you? Are you some bum? Like, you don't even have a reputation, right? And so I think that's part of what we're dealing with, So I want to mention that Kojiro was actually a better swordsman.
Yeah.
But he was Musashi actually took the first strike, despite what you guys say,
Yeah. By getting
because he
angry.
got into a psychological battle. He
Yeah.
came purposely late. He knew he would be upset. He would upset Kojiro, who's a very proper man. You know, like, so you have to be improper to a certain
Yeah.
degree. So,
Yeah.
so that's
Thank
just
you,
a
Phil.
pushback to your worshiping Musashi.
I've been properly disciplined here. Thank you.
In fact. Thank you. Well, we're at the top of the hour. I managed to put the opening of section D into the chat, but we have not actually talked about it. So, this counts as we barely made it. And next time we'll dig in and start talking about it. But I don't know about you guys, but I had a wonderful time.
I did as well. Thank you, Rick.
Well, thank you for the martial
you.
arts.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Joseph.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Hey,
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks,
Phil.
Stephen.
Stephen. You play snooker, Stephen?
I did play billiards when I was a kid. That's about it.
Oh, I just wondered. It's, in the Commonwealth, it's a standard table game.
I'll only say that I spent my life living in a bubble, and I thought I'll try and get out of that bubble to discover the truth. And I discovered the truth makes you want to vomit. I discovered the truth burns you. And if I had the choice again, I would stay in my bubble. So you guys, you're all in your bubble. Don't approach the truth. Stay in your bubble. It's more pleasant. Be like the ostrich. If there's a lion coming for you, bury your head in the sand. It feels
It's too late for me. I already saw some of the truth. It's like I gotta go full.
Yeah.
But I agree
well,
with you. I agree with you.
Okay, thanks everybody. It's
Take
been
care.
great.
Bye.